Level 1. The accused. You're 24 years old, standing in line at a bread factory in Moscow, 1937, when two men in gray coats tap you on the shoulder. They don't show badges. They don't explain. They just say, "Come with us." You go, because you think it's a mistake. It is a mistake, but not theirs. Yours was being in the wrong country at the wrong time under the wrong leader. You're taken to Lubyanka prison, a building so feared that Muscovites cross to the other side of the street just to avoid walking past it. Inside, they strip you of your name. You're now prisoner number 4471. They tell you that you're an enemy of the state, that you've been conspiring against Comrade Stalin. You haven't. You've never even owned a political pamphlet. But that doesn't matter. Stalin's quota system needs numbers. Every regional NKVD office is required to arrest a minimum number of enemies each month. You're just filling a quota. You don't need to be guilty. You just need to exist near someone who is. They interrogate you for 11 days straight. No sleep, bright lights. The same question over and over. Who are your co-conspirators? You have none. But by day 4, you name your own mother to make it stop. You sign the confession. You don't even read it. Your hand is shaking too hard. Level 2. The transport. They sentence you to 10 years hard labor, Article 58. Enemy of the people. Congratulations. They load you onto a Stalin car, a converted train wagon with wooden shelves instead of seats and iron bars instead of windows. You're packed in with 80 other men, space for 30. The smell is immediate and permanent. Body odor, urine, fear. The train doesn't stop for days. Journey. 3,000 kilometers. Duration. 18 days. Food. 1 herring/day. Water. Almost none. They give you 1 salted herring per day. No water to wash it down. Dehydration is so bad that men lick the frost off the iron bars. Outside the window, Siberia stretches forever, white and flat and empty, like the world just gave up. When the train finally stops, you step out into minus 40 degrees Celsius, and your lungs seize like a fist is squeezing them from the inside. This is Kolyma, the coldest inhabited place on Earth, and this is your home now for the next decade. The cold doesn't just freeze your body, it freezes your brain. Your thoughts slow down, your hope follows. Level 3. The new prisoner. You arrive at the camp. Rows of wooden barracks behind 3 layers of barbed wire. Guard towers with searchlights at every corner. Dogs that haven't been fed enough so they stay aggressive. You're issued your uniform. A quilted jacket called a telegreka that's never warm enough. Pants so thin you can read a newspaper through them. Boots with soles made of rubber tires. The old prisoners assess you immediately. They have a word for new arrivals. Friera. Fresh meat. If you have anything of value, an extra pair of socks, a piece of bread, a photograph of your wife, it will be taken within 48 hours. The criminal prisoners, the Urki, run the barracks. They're serving sentences for actual crimes, murder, theft, robbery, and they've been here long enough to know every angle. You're a political prisoner. That makes you the lowest rank in the hierarchy, lower than common thieves, lower than murderers. You are the enemy of the people. Even here, even among criminals, you're the scum. Your first lesson, never show weakness. Your second lesson, you are at level 4. The worker. 5 a.m. You have 15 minutes to dress, use the latrine, an open pit ditch behind the barracks, and assemble for roll call. Roll call takes an hour regardless of temperature. The guards count you, then count again. Then count a third time because the numbers never match. You stand in minus 45 while they figure out their arithmetic. Then you march to the worksite. Today it's the gold mine. You're given a pickaxe and a quota. 13 cubic meters of frozen earth per day. That's approximately the size of a small bedroom, except it's solid permafrost. To put that in perspective, professional miners in normal conditions struggle to hit 5 cubic meters. You're expected to do 13 in these conditions. On 600 calories a day, daily calories. 600 kilocalories. Work hours. 14 HRS. Temperature. Minus 45 degrees Celsius. Rest days. 0. If you hit the quota, you get a full ration. If you don't, they cut your bread. Less bread means less strength. Less strength means you hit the quota even less. This is not an accident. This is designed. The Gulag runs on the principle of using people up completely and replacing them. You are not an inmate. You are a consumable resource. The genius of the Gulag was that it made you kill yourself slowly, while making you believe the problem was your own weakness. Level 5. The hunger. Month 3. You've lost 30 pounds. Your ribs are a xylophone. Your gums are bleeding from scurvy because the only vegetable in your diet is the cabbage leaf floating in the gray water they call soup. You've started thinking about food the way normal people think about love. You dream about bread. Not fancy bread, just bread. Plain white bread with nothing on it. You wake up from these dreams in the cruelty of reality. Cold bunk, empty stomach, guards shouting outside. Hits you like a physical blow every single morning. The prisoners who are furthest gone have a name. Dokuryagi. The goners. You can spot them from across the yard. They move slowly. Their eyes are empty. They stop caring about the cold, about the guards, about the quota. They just sit. The other prisoners know what it means when a man stops caring. It means he's chosen to die. And dying in the Gulag is not dramatic. There's no last words, no moment of peace. You just stop one morning during roll call and they drag you out of the line. You promise yourself you won't become a goner. This is the same promise every single goner made. You start doing things you never imagined. You trade your bread ration for a pair of dry socks because wet feet mean frostbite, and frostbite means amputation, and amputation means you can't work, and that means the punishment block. You eat grass when you can find it. You eat pine needles. Someone tells you that pine needles prevent scurvy, and you don't care if it's true. You eat them anyway, because the alternative is sitting still and waiting to become a goner. Level 6. The survivor. Year 2. You've survived when others haven't. You've developed instincts you didn't know you had. You know which guards can be bribed with flattery. You know which criminals to avoid, and which ones can be useful. You've learned that a kind word costs nothing, and can occasionally buy you a slightly larger bread ration from the distribution point. You've become a different person, sharper, colder, smaller in your ambitions. You no longer dream of Moscow or your apartment or your wife's face. You dream of spring, just warmth, just the sun. You get a work assignment in the camp kitchen. 3 days of washing pots. It is the greatest luck of your life. You eat the residue scraped from the bottom of the pots. Actual calories, real fat. Your body responds like a machine given fuel after running on fumes. You come back to yourself slightly, enough to be dangerous, enough to start thinking again. In the Gulag, thinking is a luxury. Hope is a liability. But survival without either is just waiting to die standing up. You begin to understand the system completely. The Gulag is not about punishment. It's economics. Free labor for Stalin's industrialization. You and 18 million other prisoners are building railways, mining gold, logging forests, digging canals, all at zero cost to the state. You are the engine of the Soviet economy, an engine made of human bones. Level 7. The punishment block. Year 4. You make a mistake. A guard accuses you of stealing a ladle from the kitchen. You didn't. But in the Gulag, accusation is conviction. They send you to the shizo, the punishment isolation cell. A concrete box 2 meters by 1 meter. No bunk, no light, no blanket. The temperature is whatever the temperature outside is, minus the insulation of the walls, which is basically zero. You're given 300 grams of bread every other day. That's it. You spend 14 days in the shizo. By day 5, you've stopped feeling your feet. By day 9, you're having conversations with people who aren't there. Your mother, your childhood friend, a teacher from school whose name you haven't thought of in a decade. They feel more real than the walls. By day 14, when they open the door, you crawl out. Not walk. Crawl. The light physically hurts. You weigh less than you did during month 3. They give you 2 days to recover, then send you back to the mine. The shizo doesn't break your body. It breaks the part of you that believes your body matters. Level 8. The end of the sentence. Year 10. Your release date arrives. You've survived. Barely. You are 34 years old and you look 55. Your teeth are half gone. 2 of your toes were amputated in year 6 from frostbite. Your hands shake permanently from years of swinging a pickaxe in freezing temperatures. Your back will never straighten fully again. But you're alive. Congratulations. You've beaten the Gulag. Except they don't release you. Not really. They give you a document that says you are a free citizen of the Soviet Union. But the document also says you are forbidden from living within 100 kilometers of any major city, which means Moscow, your home, your family, your entire previous life, is off limits. They've destroyed your city life while technically freeing you. You're free in the way a bird is free after its wings have been removed. Freedom, it turns out, is a word that means different things depending on who's handing it to you. You settle in a small town in Siberia, because where else do you go? You find work, you find a room, you try to remember who you were before. But that person is gone. The man who was taken from the bread factory queue in Moscow in 1937 doesn't exist anymore. You killed him off slowly over 10 years as a survival mechanism. What's left is something harder. Something that flinches at loud noises and can't sleep without checking that the door is locked. Something that hoards bread even when there's plenty. You are free. But freedom came 10 years too late to save the person who wanted it. Level 9. The legacy. Stalin dies in 1953. The Gulag system begins to collapse. Millions of prisoners are released over the next decade. But here's the thing about 18 million people being systematically destroyed. It doesn't end when the camp's close. The trauma travels. Into children. Into silence. Survivors don't talk about what happened. Talking about it means reliving it. It also means admitting what the Soviet state did, and in 1950s Russia, that admission can still get you killed. So the silence becomes the inheritance. Your children grow up knowing only that their father is different, distant, that he hoards food for no reason, that he wakes up screaming. They don't know why. You never tell them. The Gulag took your years. The silence took everything else. They built railways with your bones. They mined gold with your suffering. And when they were done, they erased you from the history books. Because the most terrifying part of the Gulag wasn't what it did to its prisoners. It's how completely the world forgot that it existed. 18 million people passed through the Gulag system between 1918 and 1956. At least 1.8 million died inside. The real number is likely twice that. Today, most of their names are unknown. Their files are still classified. Their graves are unmarked in the Siberian permafrost. Somewhere under the frozen earth, there are men and women who were arrested for telling a joke, for owning the wrong book, for being the cousin of someone the state decided was an enemy. They're still there, waiting for someone to say their names. You were one of them. And now you know you survived the Gulag. Barely. But click the card now, because your life as a North Korean prison camp prisoner makes the Gulag look like a hotel. And that sentence is not an exaggeration.